So we're going to continue our exploration of violence in human nature by continuing to explore Milgram's experiment. So last time we looked at a particular example of a subject going through Milgram's experiment. Today we're going to look at results more generally. So about 60% of people in the role played by Teal, the teacher, follow their orders to the end, which requires that they obey the experimenter in delivering the final 450-volt shock 3 times. So basically, 60% of subjects perform the way the subject we saw performs. The results are about the same for college students, people in the working, managerial, and professional classes, and people from a variety of countries. So it seems to be pretty consistent across a wide range of ways people in our kind of society are. Then the question becomes, why? Why is it that so many people behave this way? Here's a theory. This is called the secret sadist theory by Milgram. People harbor deeply aggressive instincts continually pressing for expression, and the experiment provides institutional justification for the release of these impulses. So the secret sadist theory fits very well with H. The idea is that we're innately very aggressive. We innately want to be violent and want to harm others, but government is keeping us in check. Fear of punishment is keeping us in check. It's sort of squelching our instincts. And the experiment gives the opportunity for those instincts to come out. So the idea goes, if the secret sadist theory is right, then H is true. Then, absent government, there is a wide range of circumstances in which we will frequently behave violently towards one another, and a narrow range of circumstances in which even a significant minority of people won't. So how can we test this theory to see if this is what the experiment actually shows? Well, Milgram tried to do this in a variety of ways. Here's one. In a variation of the original experiment, teachers were told that they are free to choose any shock level for any trial. The experimenter was very careful to emphasize that the teacher can choose the highest shock level and that the experimenter would be responsible for whatever happens. The experimenters kind of suggest, look, we really want to see what happens at a wide range of shock levels, so choose what you like, and it's on us. Well, in this kind of circumstance, if the secret sadist theory were true, you would expect the results to be pretty similar to the original experiment. People are given the excuse to take out their aggressive impulses, so they'll seize it. But in fact, that's not what happens at all. In one particular iteration of this experiment, 3 of 40 people did not go beyond the lowest shock level allowed. 28 didn't go beyond 75 volts. So now instead of having a majority going all the way to the end, which requires delivering the 450 volts 3 times, you have a majority of people not going past 75 volts when things start to become painful, when the subject expresses, the person on the other side, the learner, expresses discomfort. 38 of 40 didn't go beyond 150 volts, and that's when the learner first protests loudly, so no longer just expressing discomfort, but saying, hey, I really don't like this. So when you give people the opportunity to choose their own voltage, even if they're told, look, we kind of want to see what happens with 450, go for it if you're interested, only 2 of 40 go beyond 150 volts. So the overwhelming majority stick to lower voltages. Now in this experiment, 1 went to 325 volts and 1 went to 450 volts. But far from supporting the secret sadist theory, this iteration of the experiment, this version of the experiment, suggests that only 1 person is characterized accurately out of every 40 by the secret sadist theory. So on this grounds, Milgram rejects the secret sadist theory and Zinn follows. So here's the argument. If the secret sadist theory were true, then the results in the variation we just described would resemble the results of the original experiment, but they don't resemble the results of the original experiment at all. Therefore, the secret sadist theory is false. Now here's an alternative theory. This is the one that Milgram thinks is correct, and Zinn follows. Milgram says we are inclined to obey authority, whatever the authority asks of us, even if it asks us to do something that we're otherwise not inclined to do, and maybe even if it asks us to do something that we really don't want to do. So in order to test whether the obedience theory is correct, Milgram tried to modulate factors that lead to obedience in a variety of ways and see how it affected how subjects perform. So in one version of the experiment, the experimenter was just farther away from the teacher maybe in the next room, maybe phoning it in. And in that version, only a third of the people went to the end. Instead of 2/3 going to the end, or a little less than 2/3, only a third go to the end. Another version of the experiment, you have conflicting authority figures. So one says, teacher, please continue, and another says, I actually think the teacher should stop. Now here you're still getting institutional justification for delivering the shocks from one authority figure, even if there's disagreement from another, and in that situation, nobody went to the end. In another version of the experiment, you had pure rebels. So in this version, instead of having one teacher and one learner, you have two teachers and one learner, and the teachers act together to deliver the shocks to the learner. Well, in fact, in this version of the experiment, one of the teachers, like the learner, is really a confederate, is really in cahoots with the experimenter, isn't a real subject. And this teacher who isn't a real subject is given a script to follow, just like the learner's given a script to follow. And the script says at some point, maybe after 75 volts, maybe after 150, maybe after 325, it depends on the version of the experiment, I want you, this sort of fake teacher, to stand up and say, I won't continue. And here you have the experimenter, who is the institutional authority providing justification for continuing. So a teacher who is a sadist would continue, but you have a peer who's sort of acting like the conscious, the angel on the shoulder, saying, don't continue. And what happens is the overwhelming majority of subjects refuse to continue. So you see somebody stand up to the authority, you follow, which suggests that you're not wanting to do what the authority is telling you to do. Who pulls the switch makes a big difference. So if the teacher is pulling the switch, you get about 60% following things all the way to the end. But when the experimenter is pulling the switch, or someone else is pulling the switch, and the teacher just has to instruct them to pull the switch that delivers the shock, a lot more people go all the way to the end. And again, that suggests that the secret sadist theory is false. Why? Well, if you wanted to be a sadist, you would take pleasure in being directly responsible for the shock. Pressing the button would be preferable to not. But in fact, telling someone else to press the button is preferable to pressing the button. As much, when you can distance yourself from the delivering the pain, you're more likely to do it. So Zinn's thinking about these experiments, as I said, is basically the same as Milgram's. He suggests that the experiments show something about our willingness to obey authority, but offer no evidence of an innate drive to violence. Here's a quote from Zinn now. He goes beyond just saying it doesn't provide evidence of an innate drive to violence, and instead says that this obedience is itself a learned, not an innate characteristic. So he says the subject's behavior was learned, not inborn. What they learned is what most people learn in modern culture: to follow orders, to do the job you're hired to do, to obey the experts in charge. So it is a learned response, always obey, do your job, and not a natural drive that caused so many of the people to keep pulling the pain switches. What is remarkable in the Milgram experiment, says Zinn, given the power of duty and obedience taught to us from childhood, is not that so many obeyed, but that so many refused. So, if we go back to the argument from psychology, it says that experiments from psychology show that we're disposed to behave violently whenever we don't fear punishment. So whenever there's no government, we'll be violent. That if that's true, then it supports H. But Zinn says, look, the most famous experiment that's taken to support this premise one, in fact, doesn't provide it with any support. But there's a question that's a natural question to ask, which is, are there other relevant experiments in psychology, and do they provide better support for H? Zinn doesn't really consider this. You have a paper, you're writing with limited space, but it's worth considering, and that's what we'll do next time when we talk about intergroup relations.